Welcome to Registered, the podcast of the Catholic Register, where we'll be taking a look at the stories that graced all of our platforms over the past week. I'm Mickey Conlon, editor of the Register, alongside associate editor Quinton Amundson and reporter Luke Mandato. This week's episode is brought to you by the digital edition of the Catholic Register. Go to catholicregister.org to sign up for your trial subscription at no cost and no obligation. We turn first this week to a story brought to us out of the Halifax-Yarmouth Archdiocese originally, but it's one that's got some national implications. That would be a story Luke wrote that looks into the theology behind church apologies. This is about a new Anglican-Roman Catholic Dialogue resource, the Theology of Church Apologies. Now, none of us are a stranger to having to apologize. Neither is the church. As we should know, forgiveness is at the core of our faith. And we saw just such an apology from the highest of highs in our church only a few short years ago when Pope Francis came to Canada to apologize to our Indigenous brothers and sisters for the historical wrongs done to them by the Catholic Church and its entities. Luke, why don't you tell us a little about what you found out about this whole idea of the theology of apology through your conversation with Halifax-Yarmouth Archbishop Brian Dunn?
Yeah, thanks, Mickey. It was an interesting conversation for sure. This was a story that I think, stumped us a little bit in the editorial meeting when we first pitched it. It's kind of an interesting thing on how to tackle the idea of church apologies and what they mean in their history. But through my conversation with Archbishop Brian Dunn, who's one of the co-chairs of this document, alongside Anglican Bishop Bruce Myers, we had a conversation about what sort of prompted this document. It's a pretty lengthy document. I believe it's around 33 pages in total, and it sort of sets out to use scripture, theology, different past examples from the faith to just sort of reflect on what makes church apologies genuine, what makes them effective, why apologize at all, what makes for an effective apology. And the trigger to that event, as you had touched on there, Mickey, was Pope Francis's 2022 visit to Canada, and also Archbishop Justin Welby's visit from the Anglican side of things. Again, this is from ARC, the Anglican and Roman Catholic Dialogue. Some of the things that Archbishop Dunn and I talked about was that, apology is really only the first spark. Real reconciliation requires concrete action afterwards. So we talked a lot, of course, about Pope Francis's visit and some of the historical examples of church apologies to Indigenous communities with the residential school system, also different apologies towards sexual abuse survivors, things of that sort, historical examples of anti-Semitism from the Catholic Church. So there really was, as you said, we're no stranger to church apologies. There were a lot of historical examples that we went over. But one of the big things we talked about was apology sort of giving life to that first step, to be able to then take another step to bring about true restored relations and reconciliation. That's something we talked about in great detail. And of course, as you also mentioned there, Mickey, it's something so core to our Christian faith. And that's one of the things I enjoyed most about our conversation was this idea about forgiveness as sort of what follows an apology. It's something that we as Catholics are constantly seeking in our own relationship with God, but also we have to understand how to provide it ourselves. We look at the Lord's Prayer, forgive us our trespasses and forgive those who trespass against us, is something we chatted about in depth. So it was an interesting conversation, and of course it's a two-way street. Genuine apology and forgiveness have to flow in both directions. Of course, we'll talk a little bit, Mickey, about my conversation with Cody Groat in a second, but when we were looking at the church apologies for the residential school incidents that took place, I spoke in the article about the wave of church arson and vandalism that followed, and sort of what happens when apologies are happening on one side of a relationship, but not being fully met on the other. So it was a very interesting conversation. It's a tricky balance, but I would say the main point and the point that I was most interested in was how we can go from an apology to further action. And that's something we've seen, especially with Christian and Catholic and Indigenous dialogue in the past, say, 5 or 10 years.
Well, we all know it. Talk is cheap, as a certain prime minister of ours recently, a recent one, perhaps not the one we have now, was full of a lot of that. But action speaks louder than words. And there's no doubt the Canadian Church has put action into words since the papal visit, especially in the short time, well, since that penitential journey. Quinton, as all of us, I know, but you in particular, have done a number of stories on some of these actions that the Canadian Church has taken. And when I say this, I speak mostly of the Canadian Bishops' Reconciliation Fund that is supporting a number of initiatives across the country. In many cases, they're small steps, but they're steps nonetheless. There we go, faith in action. Some thoughts from you, Quinton.
Yeah, thanks, Mickey. I mean, these are projects that really fit into what Luke tapped into in his piece about, healing and reconciliation. So, I mean, these are projects brought about by the IRF that's going to really address historical trauma, the intergenerational impacts and, the systemic injustices faced by Indigenous people. I mean, they really wanted to empower, the spirituality and really revitalize cultures that were stifled for many years. So, I mean, there's a lot of great pillars to the IRF, but the bishops today are so well equipped to have this meaningful dialogue and turn that into action because so many of them have spent some of their vocational career embedded with First Nations community. You have to think about Archbishop Murray Chatelain spent a lot of time in Saskatchewan, and now he's located in Winnipeg. And his successor, and Kiwitin Lapas, Susej Jezu, also spent a lot of time with Indigenous communities. But we see a lot of great efforts from the likes of Archbishop Richard Smith when he was in Edmonton. No doubt he's continuing that in Vancouver. Stephen Hero, who's also in Edmonton. There is a big list of people that are putting in their time and effort and taking that step beyond the initial apology.
Yeah, well, you say that, and it's mostly Western bishops because, well, we know that the greatest Indigenous presence is in Western Canada. But it is happening here. The Archdiocese of Toronto is doing its bit. We don't hear so much about it, but you've also got to remember that's one thing about the church is, talk is cheap. They put it in action. So you got to give kudos to the church for that, and not always out there looking for the pat on the back for what they do. So, Luke, you mentioned that you did speak with Dr. Cody Groat, who is the professor of history and Indigenous studies at Western University in London, Ontario. He's also a member of the Six Nations community not far from London. What are some of the thoughts you can expand on the Arc Canada resource that Dr. Groat had?
Yeah, Cody was excellent. I had spoken with him in the past when he was on the panel at King's University College alongside Noah MacDonald for a dialogue on continued dialogue in Indigenous relations with the church. So I had given him a call and just asked him to give a read through on the document and just share some of his thoughts. And he was extremely appreciative of the document's positive tone. And he actually highlighted some of the growth that Quinton was just discussing there, the growth in just the past few years and up to a decade that the church has had in terms of relationships with Indigenous communities. So he's very thankful for that. He did have a few criticisms, is mostly seen through the language used in the document, describing it as a little bit muted in places. He would have liked to seen a bit more direct examples of some of the past wrongs from the church in terms of Indigenous relationships, just to make it more authentic. He thinks it sort of diminishes the apology or the next steps when we're not naming things correctly. But still, he sees this, as you said, Mickey, as another step in a much longer process. So overall, he was very appreciative of it. Like he said, we talked about the repatriations in the past. He said that's not the end of the conversation. We talked about Pope Francis's 2022 visit. He said that's not going to be the end of the conversation. He doesn't see this document as the end of the conversation, but a great next step and something he hopes that the faithful can use at large to just get a better education and a better understanding of where apologies can lead us into right relations. So.
Well, as you said, it's going to be a long process, but the good news is the steps have been taken, and the steps are quite substantial. So, well, some people who are going to need to do some apologizing down the road, they're the people who've been pushing the expansion of MAiD, medical assistance in dying, upon this country, to the point that we're now considering letting people with mental illness to access a medically assisted death. It's made headlines worldwide and drawn widespread condemnation, even laughter amongst our peer nations. But there's some hope, however slight it might be, that there may be a change of heart on this. Quinton, tell us what you found, first here at home in Toronto, and then in your home province of Alberta, and issues surrounding MAiD.
Yeah, thanks, Mickey. We tend to really like to rely on the insights of Nicole Scheidel of Canadian Physicians for Life and Alex Schattenberg of Euthanasia Prevention Coalition. And so often we have to really get into the grim headlines, like 100,000 deaths total, which we're approaching, the rising rates, and how we're really becoming that pariah all over the world because of our euthanasia regime. But this week we got to talk about some positive developments, which was such a breath of fresh air. And they were very pleased with the Help Not Harm campaign that the Archdiocese of Toronto has put into effect. And in solidarity, dioceses across Canada are putting it prominently on their homepages. And the crux of the matter is at helpnotharmcanada.ca, you could sign up, let share your information in terms of where you're located in Canada, and then there is a form letter that's produced that you could send along to your MP, encouraging them to support Bill C-218, which would stop the intended expansion of MAiD for individuals solely living with a mental illness, supposed to come into effect on March 17th, 2027. So Nicole and Alex, very happy to see that. They're pleased that Cardinal Leo's going to be writing to Mark Carney and the Toronto MPs personally, but they want him to go a step further. They'd like to see Cardinal Leo try and sit down with Carney face to face. I think that would be a very effective means if that could be put into effect. But Bill C-218, it's going to be voted on at second reading during the first week following the Easter recess. So April 13th to 17th is going to be a big week for the anti-MAiD community. And in Alberta, very concrete actions because they took a lot of agency with their dominion over the provincial healthcare by putting in some reforms for euthanasia. They are putting in a law called Bill 18 that would stop the expansion permanently for MAiD to mental illness. It would roll back to the conditions before Track 2 MAiD, which removed the foreseeable death requirement. It's creating new reforms that'll allow Catholic hospitals to remain Catholic hospitals and not have to, offer MAiD against their will. And it will also ensure that there will be no MAiD for mature minors, and plus a lot of other regulatory mechanisms to stop these overzealous euthanasia doctors from offering their services in an out-of-control manner. So very positive. They were kind of over the moon. Of course, there's always things that Alex and Nicole would like to see improve, but they think this could really be maybe a flag being planted in the sand, and you could have a lot of provinces realizing, okay, we got to step back from the brink here. Maybe Alberta took the lead, but maybe we could see other provinces follow suit in the months ahead. Very positive stuff happening.
Well, they're first steps, but it's against the expansion of MAiD. Well, we know that MAiD has already been expanding from a death to a foreseeable death to, just almost a wild west where anyone that wants to die, medical assisted death can get it. Well, maybe it's not quite that bad, but that's the case. So, as a first step, to just keep it from going to people who have mental illness, which, of course, one of the headlines I see today says, well, if that happens, well, we could just see, such a huge increase in deaths because we know there's so many people out there with mental illness. But mental illness, it can be cured. And that's one of the things that Nicole Scheidel from the Canadian Physicians for Life is stressed in what she's got to say. So we've gotten to this point, one reason is because people support it. It's you see the stats that come out, and some numbers like 70% of people say yes, I'm in support of a medical assisted death if I need one. So I guess there's first steps, but there's a lot of steps there to that need to be made. So, but we're happy that there's something positive. But if we're going to talk about bad deaths, why don't we move on to, can we say, the greatest death ever? That, of course, would be our celebration of Easter and Jesus dying on the cross so that we can have everlasting life. Luke, you had the pleasure of talking to a number of folks in Montreal, first about the Palm Sunday procession that's coming up this weekend and the Way of the Cross next Friday on Good Friday. Let's first talk about the good news there and how these are growing events signifying a bit of a revival in an overtly secular province of Quebec.
Yeah, thanks, Mickey. It was fantastic to sort of see the growth in both of these events. It's really unbelievable. I was not expecting nearly to the extent of the growth when you read the press release or the headline before the conversation, but to hear the excitement on the organizers and the organization's face, to hear it in their voice and see it on their face when they're describing these events and their history is just incredible. And to see that it's happening in Quebec as well is amazing as well. So for that Palm Saturday walk, it's put on by their youth ministry office. It's taking place on March 28th. And the big news there is they're expecting nearly 5,000 youth and young adults to come out this year. That's up from 4,000 last year. And when I had spoken with the youth ministry team there, they said this has really been a post-COVID explosion in this event, which is something we've seen in other places, but maybe not to this extent. What the Palm Saturday walk is, it's a 5-kilometer procession from St. Joseph's Oratory to Mary Queen of the World Cathedral. It's supposed to sort of symbolize Jesus's entrance into Jerusalem. There's praise and worship music. There's the palms. There's a cross carried in rotation. When I spoke with Isabella Correa, who's the senior director of that youth mission team, she said this is the clearest sign they have of a youth revival and a young adult revival in Montreal. They said the right of election numbers are also way up this year. They're at about 240 as we just sit outside of Easter at the time of this podcast. But a very joyful and energetic tone to our conversation. Just a celebration of young people's faith, really, to see, 5,000 young adults expected to take to the streets and celebrate their faith, which is unbelievable. The other team that I spoke with was Communion and Liberation for their Good Friday Way of the Cross celebration in Montreal. This is going to be the 41st annual public procession through Old Montreal, of course, led by Archbishop Christian Lepin. This one, a little bit more of a somber tone, of course, Good Friday, almost in complete silence as they go to the different stations where they'll pray and have song. I spoke to John Zucchi, who's the national director of CL Canada, and he said every year he jokes that there's going to be fewer people turning up to this event for whatever reason. And when he arrives that year, he said there's always more than he expects. So from starting with around 20 people coming out to this Good Friday event in the pouring rain in 1996, they're looking at, and hopefully a little over 1,000 participants as of last year, and hoping for more of the same this year. So it's incredible to see just the growth, not even for events that are confined to a parish basement or to a parish hall, but events that are out in the public and in the public square, expressing our faith around this very important time in our faith in the Easter and Lenten season.
Yeah, well, here in Toronto, we've of course got the kind of the granddaddy of them all for Canada, and that's the Way of the Cross through Little Italy that comes out of St. Francis of Assisi Parish. And I don't know if you've ever seen it live. I'm sure you've seen it on TV, but it's spectacular, and the crowds that are out to see it is fantastic. How about out in Calgary? Do we see Way of the Cross out there?
Yeah, last year I did the outdoor Way of the Cross with Bishop McGrattan leading the way. That was fantastic, really down that 17th Avenue Southwest, one of the main drags. So, I mean, it's really become a big tradition. And what really Luke is getting at, you just see a lot of young people that are driving the bus here, and very positive to, see that level of reverence. And not only this, but there's just more people that are wanting to do the Eucharistic adoration and the somber stuff inside of the church, in addition to what they're doing in the public square.
Absolutely. And it's kind of a dual effect that these events have, especially when they're in the public, where Isabella Correa was saying young adults that come out for the first time are so blown away by just the witness that they're creating. They said when they're carrying the cross, to feel the weight of the cross, just does something to them. But in turn, and this is something that John from Communion and Liberation said, multiple people in the street see this procession. They see the witness. They may not even have a full understanding of what it is, and they're asking questions. Then they're following with them and asking questions as the procession goes. Next thing you know, you look behind you and they're joining the procession. And then the people that join the procession are answering questions for other strangers that are asking about what's going on. So not only do these numbers are just people that are registered, whether from the youth office or from Communion and Liberation, but they say they see people join from the streets. They see people follow them back to the church and ask how they can get involved, when it's going to be happening next year. So the fact that it's happening in public and in Quebec, Mickey, is incredible.
Yeah, the good news and the good news of Easter. So, geez, guys, I think I see another story coming up there. Oh, maybe in future editions we'll be coming back to this, and we can hear what you guys have got to say. So, I think we're going to have to go to a little bit of breaking news, because I know that this went up on our website, catholicregister.org, last night. Quinton, why don't you tell us about what that breaking news is?
Yes, Mickey, thanks. We have been talking about Bill C-9, the Combating Hate Act, a few times on this podcast, and it's generated a lot of interest. And, thanks to Catholics across the country for turning to the Register to stay abreast of this important bill. It did pass the House of Commons yesterday. At about 6:30, about 7 p.m., Toronto time. So we're going to have to really see if there will be changes or reforms in the Senate, and if the really unprecedented level of religious leaders that have spoken out, what their next moves will be. Because we heard from the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops, Cardinal Leo, so many Christian organizations, over 350 Muslim groups, some Orthodox Jewish leaders. Time will tell, as the saying goes, and turn to the Catholic Register for the latest.
Yeah, as only politicians can do. They can turn a good law into a bad one just like that. All right. So, meaning, it was meant to protect religions, and then they had to put in a clause saying, yeah, but we're not going to protect what it says in the Bible, necessarily. So, but that's an off-air story for me. It'd be a little bit salty, the language that I'd get going on that. So maybe we should end there before we start going a little crazy on it. So I'd like to thank you guys for joining me for this. Thank you to all the listeners who make this happen. And just a little reminder to go to our website, catholicregister.org, so that you can keep up with all the breaking news in the Catholic world, kind of like Bill C9. And you can also look at getting your make that free, yes, trial subscription. So go to catholicregister.org to see it all. Thanks very much again, and we hope to see you next week.